She appeared on the side of the road, drenched and shivering, her white dress clinging to her. Like a second skin. I thought I was doing the right thing by stopping, but the moment she looked up, I knew I had made a grave mistake. Now every drive feels like a nightmare I can't escape. It was the kind of night where even the stars refused to show up, rain lashed against my windshield in relentless sheets, and the wipers squeak with every pass, fighting a losing battle. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, leaning forward to peer into the darkness. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the storm, but the road ahead remained a shadowy void. I was dead tired, ironic considering what would happen next. Work had dragged on longer than usual, and the thought of collapsing into my warm bed was the only thing keeping me going. The familiar route home stretched endlessly before me, silent except for the rain, hammering the roof and the occasional hiss of my tires cutting through puddles. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought she was some kind of mirage, a trick of the rain and my sleep-deprived mind. A figure stood on the shoulder of the road, illuminated by the glare of my headlights. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her pale face, her dress, white, thin, and clinging to her frame, looked out of place, like she'd wandered out of a time long forgotten. I slowed down, my pulse quickening. Common sense screamed at me to keep driving. Don't stop. Just go. But something about her posture, how she hunched against the rain, trembling, stirred a pang of guilt in me. What if she needed help? What if she was in trouble? Against every instinct, I pulled over, rolling down the passenger side window slightly. Air rushed in, carrying with it the metallic scent of rain and something else I couldn't place, earthy, like damp soil. "Hey!" I called out, trying to make my voice heard over the storm. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" She didn't answer right away. For a moment, she just stood there, her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening for something far away. Then, slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were the first thing I noticed, dark and hollow, almost too large for her face. They locked onto mine, and for a second, it felt like the rain stopped, like the world itself held its breath. A chill ran down my spine, but before I could talk myself out of it, I unlocked the door. "Get in," I said, my voice trembling slightly. She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the open door, before stepping forward. Water dripped from her dress onto the floor mat as she climbed in. Her movements were stiff, deliberate, almost unnatural. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my grip on the wheel betrayed my nerves. "Home," she whispered. Her voice was faint, fragile, like it had been plucked from some distant echo. The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I glanced at her again. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. She shivered, but she made no effort to dry herself or speak further. "Okay," I said, swallowing hard. "Where's home?" She didn't respond. The only sound was the relentless drum of rain on the roof and the low hum of the engine. I glanced at her again, my unease growing. Her head was turned toward the window, but I could see her reflection in the glass, a faint, ghostly outline of her face, lips, moving silently as though she were whispering to the rain. I turned my eyes back to the road, focusing on the way ahead. Maybe she was just scared or cold or in shock. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd drive her to the nearest gas station or somewhere she could get help. But something about her didn't feel right. The air inside the car was cold, unnaturally so. I adjusted the heater, but it didn't seem to make a difference. My chest tightened, a nagging sense of wrongness settling deep in my gut. When I finally worked up the courage to look at her again, my heart stopped. The seat was empty. The car swerved slightly as I fought to regain control, my breath catching in my throat. I hit the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I turned to look at the passenger seat. It was still damp, a faint puddle pooling where she'd been sitting just moments ago. The door was locked, the windows closed. There was no way she could have left without me noticing. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty seat, the rain hammering against the car. My pulse thundered in my ears. Had I imagined her? Was I so exhausted that my mind had conjured a phantom? But the water was real. I didn't drive straight home that night. I couldn't. I found a well-lit parking lot and sat there, engine idling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down I knew the truth. I had made a grave mistake, and whatever had gotten into my car that night, it wasn't done. With me yet. I told myself it was nothing. The exhaustion, the stress, the rain, it had all worked together to twist my mind into seeing something that wasn't there. But as I walked into my house that night, drenched and jittery, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the kind of unease that clings to your skin, a faint whisper at the back of your head that tells you you're not alone. I went through my usual routine, kicking off my wet shoes, microwaving leftovers, and collapsing onto the couch, but the silence in my home felt louder than usual. Every creak, every faint sound of wind outside made me flinch. I turned on the TV to drown it out, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see her face staring back at me. I convinced myself I was being paranoid and headed to bed, but that night, as I lay in the dark, something woke me. At first I thought it was just a dream, soft tapping, barely audible over the rain still pattering outside, but the sound grew louder, steadier, and unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't coming from my door or my window. It was coming from the driveway. I sat up, heart racing. The thought that someone might be lurking outside made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly made my way to the front door. The tapping had stopped, but my gut told me I wasn't imagining it. The driveway was empty. My car sat there glistening under the streetlight. For a moment, I felt relief, convincing myself it was probably just a branch or the wind. But then I saw it. The driver's side window was fogged over, and on the glass were faint fingerprints, small, delicate, and clearly not mine. I froze. My body screamed at me to run back inside, but my legs wouldn't move. My gaze locked on the prints as a sickening chill washed over me. They were smeared like someone had pressed their hands against the glass from inside the car. I forced myself to approach, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I reached out and wiped at the glass, but the prints didn't smudge or fade. They stayed as if etched into the condensation. Stomach churned. I rushed back inside and locked every door and window. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the rain on my bedroom wall felt alive. Myself, it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew the truth. Something had followed me. Home. It didn't stop with the fingerprints. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. I avoided driving, taking public transport instead, but the unease didn't leave me. Every time I stepped into my car, felt like I wasn't alone. The first real encounter happened on a sunny afternoon, a rare break from the rain. I decided to take my car to the car wash, hoping to rid myself of whatever lingering reminder of that night still clung to it. I hadn't driven for more than 5 minutes when I felt it. A presence. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a fleeting second, I saw her. She was sitting in the back seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face pale and expressionless. Mine in the mirror, and I swerved violently, nearly crashing into the curb. When I whipped around to look at the back seat, it was empty. I pulled over, panting, trying to catch my breath. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. It's not real, I whispered to myself. It's not real, but the feeling wouldn't go away. That night, she appeared again. This time, I was driving home late. Illuminated only by the occasional streetlight, I spotted her standing in the middle of the road, a white dress glowing faintly in the headlights. Not again, I muttered, slamming on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, and I sat there, staring at her. Her head tilted slightly, and she took a slow step forward. I blinked, and she was gone. After that, I stopped driving altogether. It didn't matter. She followed me everywhere. At work, I'd see her reflection in the office windows. At home, I'd catch glimpses of her in the corner of my eye. She never said a word, but her presence was suffocating. I was being haunted, and I didn't know why. Desperate for an explanation, I started asking questions. Small-town rumors can be a gold mine, and in a place like ours, everyone knows the local ghost stories. I began with coworkers, easing the topic into casual conversation. You ever hear anything weird about the old highway? I asked one of them. Oh, you mean the woman in white? They smirked. Yeah, she's a legend. Supposedly she haunts that stretch of road looking for something or someone. The stories were all different. One version said she was a bride who'd been left at the altar and took her own life. Another claimed she was hit by a drunk driver and now punished anyone who didn't stop to help her ghost. None of it made me feel any better. At the diner, I asked one of the regulars. His face turned pale when I described what I'd seen. You saw her, he whispered. She's the bride. Died in a car crash on her wedding day. They say she haunts the road, looking for her fiancé, if she thinks you're him. But I stopped, I protested. I let her in my car. He shook his head solemnly. Sometimes stopping isn't enough. The next few days were a haze of sleepless nights and half-formed plans to get answers. She wasn't just haunting me anymore. She was consuming me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Every moment of silence was filled with her whispers, faint and unintelligible, but undeniably there. I knew I couldn't ignore her any longer. I started with local folklore, asking anyone who might know something about the area. At the diner, I approached an old man who always seemed to be talking about the town's past. When I described the woman I'd seen, his face went pale. You mean the bride, he muttered, barely meeting my gaze. They say she's been haunting that stretch of road for decades, long before I was born. Why? I asked, leaning closer. My voice felt raw, almost desperate. He rubbed his hands together, staring out the window, as if the answer lay somewhere beyond the rain-soaked streets. Her story's a sad one. She was supposed to be married, big wedding, beautiful dress, the whole thing. But her groom, well, he never showed. Nobody knows why. Some say he got cold feet. Others think something worse happened to him. Whatever the truth is, she couldn't handle it. He paused, his voice dropping lower. They say she drove off that night, still in her wedding dress, took the old highway, speeding like the devil himself was chasing her. She never made it. Home. I felt a lump rise in my throat.
How did she die?
The man shook his head. Depends who you ask. Some say she crashed into a tree, died instantly. Others think it wasn't an accident. They say she swerved to avoid something, maybe someone, and went off the road, drowned in the river. His words sent a chill through me. Drowned in the river. I thought of the damp footprints that had appeared in my home, the smell of waterlogged earth that seemed to cling to my car. But why me? I asked, my voice breaking. I don't know her. I wasn't even born when she died. The man finally looked at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. Sometimes it's not about what you did. It's about what you remind her of. Maybe you took a road you shouldn't have. Maybe you made a choice she can't forgive. Ghosts don't follow logic. They follow pain. His words lingered in my mind as I left the diner, but they didn't feel like enough. I needed more. That night, I combed through online archives, piecing together fragments of her story. Her name was Emily. She'd been 24, fresh out of college, and head over heels in love. The engagement had been the talk of the town. Two families coming together, a match made in heaven. But something had gone wrong. The details were murky, but the tragedy was undeniable. Emily's car had been found the morning after her wedding day. It was overturned in the river. Her body still inside. The official report listed it as an accident, but rumors swirled. Some people whispered that she'd seen her fiancé with someone else that night. Others claimed she'd been drinking her grief too much to bear. And then there were the stories about the other car, the one no one could ever prove existed. Witnesses had reported seeing headlights on the road that night, chasing Emily forcing her to swerve, but no one had ever come forward. I stared at the screen, my chest tight with a mix of dread and pity. Her story was one of heartbreak and betrayal, of a life cut short by choices she hadn't made. But what did it have to do with me? That's when I saw it, a single sentence buried in a news clipping. Emily's fiancé, John Matthews, was reported missing shortly after the incident. His whereabouts remain unknown. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. John Matthews, my father's name. It couldn't be a coincidence. My dad had passed away years ago, but I'd never heard anything about him being connected to Emily. Still, the timeline fits. He would have been in his early 20s back then, living in the same area. Was it possible? Could he have been the man who'd left her waiting at the altar? I tried to push the thought away, but it burrowed deep into my mind. If my father had been involved, if his actions had caused her death, then maybe I wasn't just a random target. Maybe she saw him in me, the way I walked, the way I carried his name. Maybe she thought it owed her something. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow felt like her presence closing in on me. For the first time, I truly understood what the old man at the diner had meant. Ghosts don't follow logic, they follow pain. And Emily's pain was far from over. The day after I discovered her backstory, things escalated in a way I couldn't have imagined. She wasn't content with appearing on the road anymore. She was everywhere, in my car, in my dreams, and now, in my home, I felt like I was being hunted. It started with small, unsettling occurrences. At first, I'd wake up to the faint sound of dripping water. I thought it was a leaky faucet, but every time I checked, everything was dry. Then the muddy footprints appeared. They began at the front door, trailing into the hallway, through the living room, and finally into my bedroom. They weren't just random marks either. They were deliberate, almost as if she'd taken her time walking through the house, inspecting every corner. The air in my house changed too. It was damp, cold, and carried the faint, earthy smell of wet soil. Even when the sun shone brightly outside, the inside of my home felt like a storm had moved in. No matter how much I turned up the heat, the chill refused to leave. My walls would groan in the middle of the night, as though the house itself was straining under some unseen weight. One night, I woke up to find my window open. Rain poured in, soaking the carpet. I rushed to close it, but as I reached out, I saw a reflection in the glass. She was standing behind me, her face pale and her eyes fixed on mine. My blood ran cold. That was the first time I truly believed I wasn't going to survive this. She wasn't just haunting me. She was trying to break me. The worst encounter came a few nights later. I was in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. The room was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive. My eyes fluttered open, and there she was, standing at the foot of my bed. Her dress clung to her body, damp and tattered. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face. But it was her eyes that froze me in place. They were empty, hollow, like two bottomless pits that threatened to swallow me whole. I tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was paralyzed. My breath caught in my throat as she stepped closer, her pale, cold hand reaching out toward me. She didn't speak, but I felt her presence, like a weight on my chest. The air seemed to thicken, and I gasped for breath, feeling as though I was drowning. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I sat up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt her near me, watching, waiting. The next morning, I found another set of footprints, this time leading away from my bed and out the door. She wanted me to know she had been there, and she wasn't going anywhere. By now, I was at my breaking point. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every waking moment felt like I was teetering on the edge of madness. I knew there was only one way to end this. I had to face her. It was pouring rain the night I decided to confront her. It felt fitting, like the storm was part of her domain, and I was walking straight into it. I drove back to the stretch of road where it had all begun. my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rain hammered against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up, but I didn't care. I had to know what she wanted from me. When I reached the spot where I had first seen her, I stopped the car and turned off the engine. "Emily," I called out, my voice shaking but firm. "What do you want from me? Why won't you?" "Leave me alone?" For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain. Then the car stalled and the headlights flickered. I felt the temperature drop and the air inside the car grew thick, suffocating. That's when I saw her. She stood directly in front of the car, her dress glowing faintly in the dim light. This time she didn't vanish. She stepped closer, her face twisted with anger and pain. Her lips moved, but the words didn't reach my ears. It was as though she was speaking directly into my mind. "You left me," she finally said, her voice echoing inside the car like a thunderclap. "I didn't mean to," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "I don't even know what I did." She reached out, her hand passing through the windshield as though it wasn't there. The car, filled with water, icy and suffocating, rising quickly until it reached my chin. I gasped for air, my chest burning, my vision blurring. It felt like her grief was drowning me, pulling me into her world. As the water closed over my head, I thought I was going to die, but then everything stopped. The water was gone and the car was dry. I was gasping for air, my body trembling, but I was alive. She was gone. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. She had shown me enough for me to understand. I had to put her to rest. I spent hours searching for her grave, following the clues from her backstory. When I finally found it, hidden in the overgrown corner of a cemetery, I felt a pang of sorrow. Her headstone was cracked and weathered, the inscription barely legible. It was clear no one had visited her in years. I knelt before the grave, a bouquet of white roses in my hand. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you. You didn't deserve any of it." For a moment, the air felt lighter, as though her presence had finally lifted. I thought I had done enough. I thought I was free. Weeks passed without incident. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The house was warm, the air no longer damp. The footprints and whispers were gone, and the nights were quiet. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. It was too quiet, too normal. Then one night, as I was pulling into my driveway, I caught a glimpse of something in the rear-view mirror. Her. She was sitting in the back seat, her hollow eyes meeting mine. A cold, knowing smile spread across her face, and I realized the truth. She hadn't forgiven me. She hadn't moved on. She never would. The night was unnaturally still as I parked my car in the driveway. The soft hum of the engine faded, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. Gripping the steering wheel, convincing myself I was safe now, but deep down, I knew better. My fingers hovered over the ignition key, trembling. The reflection in the rearview mirror caught my eye, a faint shimmer, like condensation creeping across glass. My breath hitched as the shimmer solidified. She was sitting in the back seat again, her hollow eyes locked on mine. "Leave me alone," I whispered, but my voice cracked, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. Her lips twitched into a faint, chilling smile. She leaned forward, her face inches from mine, separated only by the fragile barrier of the mirror. Her voice came low, like a cold wind slipping through a crack in the door. "You can't run." The car doors locked with a heavy thunk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the still night. My hands flew to the handle, yanking uselessly. The engine roared to life on its own, the headlights flaring as the car jolted forward. My pulse spiked and I slammed my foot on the brake, but the pedal wouldn't budge. "Stop," I screamed, but the car only accelerated. The road outside blurred as the speed climbed. Her laughter filled the cabin, soft, broken, and impossibly close. It wasn't coming from the back seat anymore. It was beside me. I turned my head slowly, my heart threatening to claw its way out of my chest. She was sitting in the passenger seat, her dress dripping onto the floor mat, water pooled around her feet, creeping toward mine like icy tendrils. Her gaze was fixed ahead, but her mouth moved, whispering something I couldn't make out. The windshield began to fog over, not from the rain outside, but from within. Words etched themselves in the condensation, one agonizing stroke at a time. "You're mine." The car swerved violently and I screamed, gripping the wheel as it twisted against my control. Images flashed in the corner of my vision: dark roads, a riverbank, her broken body crumpled in the water. It wasn't just a haunting anymore. She was showing me her death, forcing me to relive it, to feel the cold grip of her final moments. The headlights went dark, plunging everything into blackness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind that makes your ears strain for sound. Then her voice came again, soft and final, brushing against my ear. "We're not done." The car stopped abruptly. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my driveway, the engine silent. Everything seemed normal, except for the passenger seat. It was soaked, a puddle of water, glistening in the dim moonlight. I stumbled out of the car, my legs barely holding me up. The house loomed in front of me, dark and unwelcoming. I glanced back at the car one last time, and that's when I saw it. The rearview mirror was still fogged, the words "you're mine" faint but unmistakable. And in the reflection, her face lingered, not in the back seat, not in the passenger seat, but standing directly behind me. I ran inside, slamming the door shut and locking it, though I knew it wouldn't help. I sank to the floor, breathing hard, my mind racing. The house was silent, but it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. It was the kind that hides things. And then I heard it, a faint knock on the window. "You've read my story, but I have to warn you. Every retelling strengthens her. She feeds on fear, and the more you think about her, the closer she gets. So tell me, you're alone as you finish this, or is something watching you, waiting? Would you know if she followed you home, or will you only realize it when it's too late?" The stone tablet at the entrance wasn't just decorative. It listed rules, strange and specific, carved deep into its weathered surface. "Do not enter the garden after dark," it warned. I thought it was just superstition, until I broke one of the rules and heard the whispers calling my name. When I first arrived at the estate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The driveway was long and winding, flanked by ancient trees whose gnarled branches twisted overhead like skeletal fingers. My car's tires crunched against the gravel, the sound muffled by the heavy stillness around me. The estate loomed at the end of the path, a towering structure of dark stone, its edges softened by creeping ivy. The windows glared back at me like cold, dead eyes. I wasn't sure what I had expected: a bustling property with a team of workers, maybe a warm greeting at the door, but there was only silence, no movement, no signs of life. The wind carried faint whispers through the trees, and I told myself it was just my nerves. After all, it wasn't every day you took a job in a place that felt more like the setting of a gothic horror novel than a workplace. As I stepped out of the car, something caught my eye. Just to the right of the gate stood a moss-covered stone tablet. It was old, older than the house itself, it seemed, and the words carved into its surface were deep and deliberate. Number 1, do not enter the garden after dark. Number 2, do not leave food outside after sunset. Number 3, do not look into the lake under the full moon. I read them aloud, half laughing to myself. Rules carved in stone, dramatic much, but something about the way the letters were etched, so precise, so stern, made me pause. The moss clinging to the edges of the words seemed almost alive, shifting slightly in the breeze. Before I could think too much about it, the mansion door creaked open. A tall, thin woman stepped out, her dark dress blending almost seamlessly with the shadowy interior. Her face was severe, framed by streaks of silver hair, and her eyes, sharp and cold, seemed to take my measure with a single glance. "I assume you're the new groundskeeper," she said, her voice clipped. She introduced herself as Mrs. Whitlock, the housekeeper. Without waiting for a reply, she gestured for me to follow. Her. I grabbed my bags and trailed behind her into the mansion, glancing back at the tablet one last time. A shiver ran down my spine, though the evening air was warm. I told myself it was just the isolation of the place, the eerie quiet, but deep down I knew it was more than that. The inside of the mansion was as cold and foreboding as its exterior. The grand hall was dimly lit, the chandeliers above casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic like rusted iron. The floor creaked underfoot as Mrs. Whitlock led me through a maze of hallways, her steps precise and deliberate, like someone who had walked these halls for years. "You'll follow the rules," she said abruptly, her voice slicing through the quiet. She didn't look back as she spoke. "They're there for your safety, and they're not to be questioned." "Right," I said, my voice betraying my skepticism. "But what's the deal with them? Some kind of tradition? Tradition?" She stopped suddenly, turning to face me, her eyes steely and unyielding. "Tradition," she said slowly, "and necessity. This estate is not like other places. It has—" I raised an eyebrow. "Quirks? What kind of quirks require rules carved into stone?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "People who break the rules," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "don't stay long, and they don't leave whole." Her words hung in the air, heavy and chilling. I wanted to laugh, to shrug it off as some elaborate scare tactic, but the look in her eyes made my stomach turn. This wasn't a joke to her. She handed me a small notebook, the rules written neatly on the first page. "Study these. Follow them. And whatever you do, stay out of the garden after dark." I nodded, more to end the conversation than out of belief. She gave me a brief tour of the mansion, pointing out the kitchen, the library, and my quarters of the property. It was cozy enough with a view of the garden. "Your work begins tomorrow," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Remember the rules?" I spent the evening unpacking, but her words gnawed at the back of my mind. As the sun set, I glanced out the window at the garden. In the fading light, the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, like something was moving just beyond the hedges. I pulled the curtain shut and locked the door. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely uneasy. This job was supposed to be simple, chance to get away from the noise of the city. But something about this place, this house, didn't feel right. I didn't realize it yet, but the rules weren't just there to protect me. They were there to keep something out. The next morning, I stepped into the garden for the first time in daylight. It was breathtaking, like something pulled from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The hedges were impossibly tall, their intricate patterns forming mazes that seemed to shift the longer I stared at them. Ancient trees loomed over me, their branches forming shadowy arches. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered patches, illuminating clusters of vibrant flowers that looked almost too vivid to be real. Statues dotted the pathways, each more exquisite than the last. They depicted humans and animals, frozen mid-motion, a man shielding his eyes from the sun, a woman holding a bouquet of roses, a crouching lion that seemed ready to pounce. Their expressions were hauntingly lifelike. As I passed them, I couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes followed me. I brushed the thought aside, chalking it up to my imagination. I threw myself into work, pruning the hedges and pulling weeds from the flower beds. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a combination that was almost intoxicating. While I lost myself in the rhythm of the task, but there was an unease I couldn't ignore. The garden was too quiet. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. The only sounds were my tool scraping against the soil and the faint rustling of leaves. As the hours passed, I began to notice peculiar details. The flowers, for instance, seemed to turned toward me as I moved, as though they were watching. The statues felt unnervingly warm. When I brushed against them, like sun-warmed stone, even in the shade. Center of the garden, a grand structure surrounded by more statues, seemed to hum faintly, though I couldn't pinpoint the source of the sound. As the sun began its descent, the garden changed. Shadows stretched across the ground, swallowing the brightness of the day. The air grew heavier, cooler, and the silence became oppressive. I glanced at my watch and realized it was nearly sunset. Mrs. Whitlock's warning about the rules rang in my ears. I quickly packed up my tools, but the urge to glance over my shoulder was almost unbearable. The statues stood still, their faces blank and lifeless in the dim light. But as I turned to leave, I swore I saw one of them shift, a subtle tilt of the head or a flicker of motion in its hand. My chest tightened, and I hurried toward the exit, refusing to look back. The day I broke the first rule, I wasn't trying to tempt fate. I had simply lost track of time. Trimming the hedges near the fountain was slow, meticulous work, and the hours slipped by, unnoticed. By the time I looked up, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the garden was bathed in the eerie glow of moonlight. The transformation was instant. The vibrant greens of the hedges turned dark and foreboding, the flowers wilting in the shadows. The air grew colder and the silence deepened, broken only by the faint sound of leaves rustling, except there was no wind. I gathered my tools in haste, cursing myself for not paying attention to the time. As I made my way toward the exit, a sound stopped me in my tracks. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, a whisper, delicate and melodic, drifting through the air. I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't just random noise. It was words. My name was among them. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, but the path seemed longer than I remembered. The statues lining the walkway loomed over me, their faces cast in deep shadow. They felt closer, though I hadn't seen them move. One statue, a tall figure with an anguished face, was directly in my way, though I was certain it hadn't been there earlier. My breath hitched. I muttered, "Stop it," though I didn't know who I was speaking to. My chest felt tight, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. I stepped around the statue, refusing to look back, and broke into a jog toward the guest house. The whispers followed me all the way to the door. That night, I didn't sleep so much as fall into an uneasy stupor. My dreams were fragmented, disjointed scenes of the garden under a blood-red sky. The hedges twisted and writhed like living things, and the statues surrounded me in a tight circle, their stone faces glaring down. Their eyes were alive, burning with malice, and their mouths moved in silent accusations. I woke up with a start, gasping for air. My body was drenched in sweat, and my hands trembled. As I fumbled for the light switch, the room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. My breath slowed as I reassured myself it was just a dream. Then I saw the footprints. They started at the door of my guest house, muddy, wet prints that led in a straight line to the foot of my bed. The air in the room was damp, carrying the earthy scent of wet soil. I stared at the footprints, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. I hadn't left my room after returning from the garden, and there was no sign of anyone outside. My chest tightened as I followed the trail with my eyes. The footprints stopped at the edge of the bed but didn't turn around. Whoever, or whatever, had left them hadn't left the room. I slept with the lights on after that, though I didn't sleep much at all. The next morning, I confronted Mrs. Whitlock. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision. I hesitated before speaking, unsure how to explain what I had experienced. There were footprints, I finally said, my voice trembling, muddy ones, in my room, and I've been hearing whispers. It started after I worked late in the garden. Mrs. Whitlock froze. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the knife. Slowly, she turned to face me, her sharp eyes narrowing. "I told you not to stay in the garden after dark," she said, her tone clipped but heavy with something deeper, fear, perhaps, or anger. I thought the rules were, I don't know, superstitions or traditions, I admitted, my voice faltering. I didn't think. You didn't think, she interrupted, her voice rising.
That garden is cursed. Do you understand?
Me. It isn't just a place, it's alive. And now it's noticed you. I stared at her, stunned. She sighed and wiped her hands on her apron, then gestured for me to follow her. Together, we walked to the window overlooking the garden. She pointed to the statues near the fountain. Look closely next time, she said, her voice a whisper. Those aren't statues. They're the one who broke the rules. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to laugh, to deny it, but something in her expression stopped me. I glanced at the statues, my stomach twisting. Their faces, anguished, terrified, suddenly looked too real. Leave, she said, while you still can. I tried to take Mrs. Whitlock's advice, but the garden wouldn't let me. Every time I passed by the window, I felt its pull, a silent magnetic force that drew my eyes to the maze of hedges and the eerie statues. The whispers started again, faint and far away, but persistent. At first I thought they were in my head, but soon they seemed to be coming from outside. One afternoon, as I cleaned the tool shed, I found myself staring out at the fountain. The sunlight glinted off its surface, and the statues around it stood motionless, their faces calm. But the longer I looked, the more I felt like they were waiting for me. That night, I couldn't resist any longer. I stepped outside, the cool air biting at my skin. The garden was bathed in moonlight, every leaf and stone glowing with an otherworldly sheen. The whispers began immediately, threading through the air like a melody. They weren't just calling me, they were pulling me in. I wandered toward the fountain, my feet moving as if under someone else's control. When I reached the water, I hesitated, leaning over to peer into its still surface. My reflection wasn't there. Instead, the faces of others stared back at me, distorted, frozen in terror, their mouths wide in silent screams. I couldn't live like this anymore. The whispers followed me everywhere, even during the day. I'd see flickers of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong. My sleep was plagued by nightmares of the statues moving, their cold hands reaching for me. One foggy night, I grabbed a flashlight and went back to the garden. If this was going to end, I had to confront whatever was haunting me. The gate creaked open, and the whispers surged. Louder now, almost frantic. The air was thick and cold, making it hard to breathe. The statues were waiting. I knew it before I even reached the fountain. Their positions had changed, subtle but undeniable. A woman who had once faced the hedges now stood with her gaze fixed on me, her stone eyes glowing faintly in the mist. My pulse raced as I stepped closer, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The whispers grew into a chorus of voices. They weren't just speaking anymore. They were screaming. The statues began to move, their cracked faces shifting into grotesque expression of rage and hunger. One stepped forward, its hollow eyes boring into mine. I stumbled back, but the ground beneath me felt like it was sinking. Something cold wrapped around my ankle. I looked down and saw a hand, pale and gnarled, emerging from the earth. I screamed, wrenching my leg free and running for the gate. The statues lunged at me, their laughter cruel and endless. I barely made it out, slamming the gate shut behind me, but as I leaned against it, gasping for air, the whispers continued. They were inside me now, their voices soft but insistent. Stay with us, forever. I woke up with sunlight streaming through the window, and for a fleeting moment, I thought it had all been a dream. The night before felt like a fevered nightmare, running, screaming, the statues moving in ways that defied everything I understood. My heart still pounded as I swung my legs over the bed and glanced outside. The garden was serene, its beauty almost mocking in the daylight. The statues stood perfectly, still, their faces calm and lifeless, but as my gaze swept over them, my stomach dropped. One of them stood near the fountain, a figure I didn't recognize. It wasn't there yesterday. I squinted, leaning closer to the window. The statue was of a man, his face twisted in terror, his hands raised as if to shield himself from some unseen horror. The features were familiar, too. Familiar. My knees buckled as I realized why. The face was mine. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My mind raced, desperate to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my exhausted brain was playing cruel games, but deep down I knew what Mrs. Whitlock had said was true. The statues weren't just carvings, they were victims. I packed my bag in a frenzy, tossing clothes and essentials into my duffel without care. I had to leave, now. Whatever curse this place held, I couldn't let it take me. But as I zipped up the bag, I caught sight of something in the mirror. I froze. My reflection stared back at me, or at least it should have, but the face in the mirror wasn't moving with me. It stood frozen, its mouth slightly open, its eyes wide and unblinking. The skin was pale, cracked, like weathered stone. I raised my hand slowly. My reflection didn't. A whisper filled the room, soft and insistent, curling around me like cold fingers. Forever. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. My reflection began to change, its stone features twisting into something monstrous. I backed away from the mirror, clutching my head as the voices burrowed deeper, louder, until I couldn't hear my own. Thoughts. No, I whimpered, tears streaming down my face. This isn't real. But it was. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me as I fled the house, shoving the door open and sprinting down the driveway. The tablet at the gate seemed to glow faintly, the carved rules mocking me as I passed. I didn't dare look back at the garden or the house. I didn't dare look at anything. The road stretched endlessly before me, my car parked far ahead. Even as I ran, they clung to me, their soft, melodic chant echoing in my ears. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit. She was there. Not a statue, not a reflection. Her face, a pale, lifeless woman, stared back at me from the back seat, her mouth curving into a faint smile. My scream caught in my throat as her cold, stone-like hand touched my shoulder. You've heard my story, but it doesn't end here. Every time it's told, every time someone reads it, the whispers grow louder. They want more. They need more. Are you brave enough to share this tale, or will you keep it locked inside, hoping they won't find you? Are you sure you're alone right now, or is there a statue in the shadows waiting for you to look away?